indexes of trade by in the following way. So for each industry, let's say cars, you're going to compute the value of your exports, and then you're going to minus the value of the imports. And so I'm going to go for the extremes because that's very straightforward to explain. If, for example, the value of your exports in cars is exactly the same as the value of your imports in cars, so this xi minus this mi is 0, then this Google-Lloyd index is going to be equal to 1. And so we're going to say that the closer that GL index is to 1, the greater the extent of intra-industry trade. In my example, it was really because I export cars worth 1 billion and I also import cars worth exactly 1 billion. So just intra-industry trade. By contrast, if I export cars, this XI worth 1 billion, say, for example, to Portugal, then it wouldn't be too surprising for you to learn that I will not be importing any cars from Portugal, because Portugal does not produce any cars, of course. And so this is going to be 0. Portugal's value in exports of cars to the UK is actually not true. I shouldn't say this nonsense, because there are many, many famous makes that are producing in Portugal, but just like nowadays, plenty of German makes that are producing in the UK. But anyway, the idea is that if you don't export any cars, then of course then this is going to be 0. And so what you get is the index is going to be equal to 1 minus this value over the same value, and so it's going to be equal to 0. Yeah, because this over that is just going to be equal to 1. Yeah, so to go back to the example, I export xi equal to 1 billion. I don't import any cars, so this is 1 billion. The sum of these two is also 1 billion. The ratio is equal to 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Yeah? So this is just, you don't need to know this stuff in detail. It's just, unless I had explained this, how you compute these Google-Lloyd indices, it would have been a bit difficult to interpret these numbers. So these are now the things that really matter. So the indexes of intra-industry trade for the US. So as you can see, the crucial thing is that there's an enormous number of industries that have very high levels of intra-industry trade. Remember, if this is very close to 1, what this is saying is that the value of the stuff I'm exporting in this industry is more or less equal to the value of my imports in the same industry. Yeah? If this is very far away from 1, so this is very close to 0, then this means that the intra-industry trade in this sector is going to be minimal. And so it shouldn't be too surprising. Clothing and apparel, for example, there's very little intra-industry trade in the US. Why? Because the US imports the vast majority of the clothing and apparel from poorer countries. Yeah? The same thing for footwear. So, all right. So you can do that for industries, and now you can compute a weighted averages of those Google-Lloyd indices and get a sense of how much of the trade in a country is intra-industry and how much of it is inter-industry. Yeah? And what you get, as you can see, is that there is, as I told you before, enormous proportion of trade that is intra-industry. Or look at all of these European countries, but also the US is there, and so is Mexico. So as you can see, it doesn't have to, it's not necessarily related to levels of development. And then you have some countries that have very low levels compared to others. So the two surprising countries I would have, or the three more surprising countries I would say are these three. So what's going on here? And the answer is, should be more or less obvious. Australia is this gigantic country, very, very rich in natural resources. They export disproportionately to the rest of the world their primary commodities, in particular to China, and so not a lot of intra-industry trade. Norway, as you know, is this small European country just with enormous resources of oil. The oil exports represent a disproportionate percentage of the exports of the country. So because they don't need to import any oil, again, this makes this ratio, the intra-industry index low. And New Zealand is going to be to some extent similar to Australia. So what they export is quite different from what they import. But as you can see, for many, many countries, these shares are just very, very, these indices are just very, very high. Now, what sort of classification level of disaggregation we went for here? 59 industries. So it's no longer that those basic 10 industries. Think of splitting each of those 10 industries into 6, and you get about these 60. Yeah. This is for the world as a whole, just to yet again motivate why it does make sense to look at this stuff in detail. The world share of intra-industry trade. So if you go for the disaggregation with only 59 industries, so you're looking at this. You're looking at this curve here. Then, as you can see, there's more than 50% of world trade that is intra-industry, and so this shows you why. And it has been increasing very substantially throughout from the 1960s onwards. However, if you go for much more detailed industry classification, the trend is exactly the same, but of course it's not that you don't get the same number. So what this is saying, for example, is that here, if you think about food, so we have 59 industries, it might well be that they go for dairy products. Yeah. So dairy products, of course, this is our industry, and so if the UK exports some dairy products to France and imports dairy products from France, then this is going to be classified as intra-industry trade, because we're just looking at dairy products. Is that all right? But now if we move down the classification, if we say, no, it's just not 59 industries, it's 1,100. So each of those basic industries will have 100 more detailed industries. And then what matters is not dairy products, but actually, say, cheddar cheese and brie or camembert or whatever. And then there's no longer going to be intra-industry trade. So it's one thing to say the UK exports cheese and imports cheese, so this looks like intra-industry, but once you go down the classification and say, no, there's not simply cheese, there is cheddar cheese or Stilton, and then is camembert or brie or roquefort or whatever, and so, no, the UK will only be exporting their cheese and will be importing the other cheese, and there's very little intra-industry trade. Yeah? So this is inevitable. The greater the degree, the greater the detail of the industry classification, the smaller the fraction of trade that is going to be classified as intra-industry. Yeah? But irrespective of that, you can still see, even with those 1,161 separate industries, there's still a huge proportion of trade, something like 30%, that is intra-industry. So we really need to think about why this happens, and it's due to increasing returns. But we look at a model that is actually quite simple and can be illustrated on a two-dimensional diagram, and you'll have that in your in textbook, as well as in one of the readings on the topic. So, Paul Krugman, I think all of you know who Paul Krugman is, so he writes very, very regularly in the New York Times and so on, has these blogs and so on, but in terms of of his academic work, Paul Krugman is known for his work in international trade. And in 1999, he got the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in trade and geography. So one of the readings I gave you was about his work and his key contributions to the literature. Yeah, and it's about this part of the literature on international trade. Okay, you're looking a bit tired, so I'm going to give you 1 minute to kind of switch off, and then we'll carry on for a few more slides. Shall I show you more wonderful news?
Who's not tired with 2 hours of lectures?
Can't focus for
Okay, I
2
might show you
hours.
something. I'm not entirely sure how many of you know this stuff. So there's lots of you, some of you, one of my personal tutees yesterday came to me and said, I want to learn languages. And yeah, that's fine. But one great way to learn languages is actually to read the news in another language. So the BBC, it's a really good, it's a fantastic broadcaster. And you know that you're not going to read rubbish, but you can actually read the news in many other languages. And so you go down, and as you can see, there's a lot more. So, for example, Brazil, it's going to be Portuguese, of course. Mundo, it's going to be in Spanish. So there's lots of there's going to be many of the news you get in English that will have been translated into Spanish, but then you'll get stuff that is more specific. So, for example, Venezuela and Argentina are going through some rough times, and you have news about these two countries. So this is about Argentina, and this is about Venezuela. But this, if I go back to the languages, more languages, it's very, very good, guys. Look at this. So we're paying for this. Taxpayers, we're all paying for this. It's that license fee. But it's just fantastic. It's very, very, very good. You have it in French. Look at all these languages. Really, really great. So yeah, I mean, this is something you could now, for example, well, you're preparing for your exams, but if you want to be to know about what's happening in the world, and you want to polish your languages at the same time, well, remember that you can do this stuff. Okay, shall we go back? Yeah, so looking forward. Right. So monopolistic competition and trade, slide 1. So what we start off with is to say there is a good reason why some countries will want to export and import the same product, let's say cars. It's because there is this huge variety of tastes. Some people will actually believe that the Fiats are better cars than BMWs. I'm sure they are, or at least per unit of quality at least. And so there may be people that will be willing to buy Italian cars, even though German cars have a much better reputation. And there are all sorts of other reasons, style and so on, the design and what they do. And this is captured by, again, this stuff is abstract, is by assuming that the typical person has this variety, that has these preferences for variety. So what we're saying here is that you get utility from consuming goods and from consuming quantity, QI of each good, but that good is just a variety. And so all else being the same, the greater the variety of goods you consume, the better. Yeah? And this is what's going to be behind people's sort of wishes to buy from a more diverse set of car manufacturers. Is that not all, they will naturally like this variety and they will value it. Now the firms, it's very, very simple. We are assuming there are increasing returns to scale. What this means, of course, is that it translates directly into costs. constant returns to scale means that the average cost of production is always the same. Decreasing returns to scale